Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. In this video, we are going to discuss the biblical flood account in Genesis 6, chapters 6 through 9, and compare it along with three other Mesopotamian accounts, the tale of Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Eridu Genesis. So if you like this sort of content, please don't hesitate to hit the like button and subscribe. And make sure to leave your comments or your thoughts in the comments section down below. So without further ado, let's dive into it. So before the book of Genesis ever took shape, an account of a massive flood had already been circulating throughout the ancient Near East. The account was passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth through the centuries. And alterations occurred throughout as these accounts were passed down from generation to generation, thereby shaping details differently, catering to the different audiences. Walton's idea that I mentioned in the Sea Myth video a week ago, of a cultural river of which the cultures of the ancient Near East seems applicable here as considering these literary works. Walton uses a great example as well with Nathaniel Hawthorne, who adapted the Greek myths from classical Greece in Wonder Book, or Walt Disney rewriting Arabian Nights in Aladdin. I think it is also very important here to compare other versions of the flood accounts so that we can reconstruct a trail of literary evolution in the ancient Near East. Furthermore, it is rather difficult to dissociate the flood account of the Bible from other ancient Near Eastern accounts because of the similarities of these accounts of the tale of Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Eridu Genesis, all of which shall be summarized below. Finally, I will leave out the Eridu Genesis simply because there is so much missing from the text. However, scholars have used the tale of Atrahasis to more or less reconstruct the missing bits. So I will include, though, the Eridu Genesis in the comparison chart later on. First up, the tale of Atrahasis. The epic, which dates to the 17th century BCE, begins with humanity making noise that causes not only Enlil, but also the lesser gods, or the Igigi, insomnia and annoyance. It is Enlil who plans on reducing the population through a plague, and it is here that we are introduced to our main character, Atrahasis. It is Atrahasis who, with the help of Ea, the god of ritual purification, averts the plague. After 1200 years, Enlil sends a drought on the population. Once more, the drought is brought to a speedy halt thanks to Ea. Enlil then sends another drought, but is again thwarted by Ea and Atrahasis. Exasperated, of course, Enlil finally sends a flood. On the advice of Ea, though, Atrahasis constructs a boat to weather the flood that will last 7 days and 7 nights. The epic reads, Adad, the storm god, was roaring in the clouds. The winds were furious as he set forth, and he cut the mooring rope and released the boat. The flood was extremely devastating, though, that it not only wiped out humanity, but also caused the gods great concern. Why, do you ask? Because the gods depended on humanity for food. So after the flood, Atrahasis makes an offering for his preservation of the gods because they had been left wanting for the entirety of the flood. And the epic ends with the gods controlling the population of humanity by sending a demon, closing the wombs of the women, and imposing celibacy. Next up, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for our purposes here, can be found on the 11th tablet of the epic, and the epic dates between 2150 and 1400 BCE, and is like the Epic of Atrahasis in that a flood did transpire. However, our heroes are different, and there seems to be an end goal here for the hero of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, and he was an impetuous and rather young ruler. Furthermore, he was rather harmful towards his subjects. So, to counteract Gilgamesh, the gods created and sent Enkidu, who was a wild man who lived and ran with wild animals, and he confronted Gilgamesh. and he discovers Gilgamesh and becomes extremely angry with him, namely because he beds all the brides of the city on their wedding nights. So the two fight each other, but no one really gains the victory or the upper hand, so they decide to call it quits and become friends. But in a twist, the goddess Ishtar, the goddess of love and war that we all know, offers a marriage to the unsuspecting Gilgamesh, who was bathing. Gilgamesh, though, refuses the proposal, prompting the anger of Ishtar. And Ishtar responds by pleading to her father, the god Anu, who is the god of heaven, for vengeance. And Anu sends a bull, whom Gilgamesh promptly defeats and slays. Anu then kills Enkidu, his friend, which so affects Gilgamesh that he realizes his own mortality. So he decides to seek out Utnapishtim, who obtained eternal life. Well, we actually learn that Enlil, in his determination, sought to destroy by way of a flood after he meets up with Utnapishtim. That is, when Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim was warned to build a ship, give up any possessions, and take aboard all living things. After building the ship, the gods send their deluge, which was so terrifying again that even the gods were fearful. And you have to remember again, just like the tale of Atrahasis, the humans were serving the gods. They were feeding the gods. So again, they were fearful that if you wipe out humanity, there would be no food. So after the flood receded, the ship rested on Mount Nimush, or Nizir, I think, after which Utnapishtim sent out a dove, swallow, and finally a raven, which did not return. Gilgamesh then inquires Utnapishtim about eternal life. But Utnapishtim informs Gilgamesh about a plant at the bottom of the sea that can provide eternal life. However, a serpent eats the plant, leaving Gilgamesh hopeless. So the epic ends with Gilgamesh returning to the city of Uruk, and he lives out his days therein, unable to obtain immortality. So with these 4 accounts of the flood, you can see there is some comparison to be had here. We can go ahead and start from left to right here. There was a flood that was divinely planned in the biblical account. Then you had the gods. All of it was divine, was planned by the gods or God in case of the biblical account. 2, it was divine revelation. It was disclosed to the hero of the biblical account, Noah, whereas the divine revelation was disclosed to Atrahasis and Utnapishtim in the other 2 accounts, while in the Eridu Genesis, the divine revelation was disclosed to Ziusudra. And of course, the reasons were somewhat different between the biblical account and the Mesopotamian accounts. The reason for the biblical account, of course, was sin. And the reason for the Mesopotamian accounts was because they were causing noise and annoying the gods. The next, punishment was just and ethical in that humanity was committing sin against God, so God decided to punish with a flood. In the Mesopotamian accounts, it was ambiguous and regretted. And the Eridu Genesis, we simply just are unsure. We just don't know. The salvation of Noah and his family, along with representatives of each animal, happens in the biblical account after the flood. The animals are representatives of living things, which occurs throughout all 3 Mesopotamian accounts. So what actually happened in the flood? Well, there were land upheavals, subterranean waters, and heavy rains in the biblical account. And in the Mesopotamian account, it seems to be the same. It was winds, rains, and the breaking of dikes. The duration varies between the biblical account and the Mesopotamian accounts as well. We have the duration of 40 days and 40 nights. And then in the biblical account and in the Mesopotamian accounts, each one of the accounts says the duration lasted 7 days and 7 nights. Got you. The boats land on different mountains. So in the biblical account, the boat lands on the Mount of Ararat, whereas in the Mesopotamian accounts, the boat lands on Mount Nizir. And of course, in the Eridu Genesis, we're unsure, but more than likely, it could be Mount Nizir as well. In the biblical account, the account says it sent out a dove 3 times, whereas in the Mesopotamian accounts it was a dove, swallow, and a raven. And again, the Eridu Genesis lacks that information, which is why I didn't really include the summary like the other 2 accounts. We have the sacrifice of worship in the biblical account, whereas in the other 3 accounts it was the sacrifice of appeasement. And finally, the blessings. So in the biblical account, there was the blessing of an earthly covenant, whereas in the tales of Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis was a blessing of living in paradise. Utnapishtim gains immortality in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Eridu Genesis we're not really sure again. So, I know in the last video, or at least in my video on the sea myth, we discussed hints of the sea myth, or at least the sea myth or chaos kampf in the creation accounts. Well, Tremper Longman here suggests that the flood account of the Bible may hint at the sea myth as well in Genesis 6 through 9. He notes that the writer uses non-order, that is the cosmic water, to destroy disorder, that is evil and violence. Then God takes up rulership once more after resetting his temple or palace and resetting creation. So like Tremper, like Dr. Longman here, I tend to believe that Genesis 6 through 9 does hint at the sea myth here, which can also be found not only in the biblical account, but also the tale of Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Eridu Genesis, and in the same manner I will discuss below. So support does exist for the sea myth, like I said, when Genesis 6 and 9 are laid against the backdrop of Genesis 1 and 2 as well. We've got non-order in Genesis 1, we've got the construction of his temple and palace in Genesis 1 and 2, and the creation of humanity in Genesis 2. Just like the tale of Atrahasis in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we can see the same pattern laid out. We've got non-order, and then there's the resetting of creation, but the palace and temple seems to be lacking, at least in those 3 epics. So, finally, where did the flood accounts come from, actually? So while both Longman, Tremper Longman, Doctors Longman and Walton argue that archaeological and geological evidence for a global flood are scant, and rightfully so, flooding in general, though, was a fairly common occurrence throughout the ancient Near East. And additionally, I do not think that the flood account of the Bible is just pure myth, in the sense that it's fiction. I am actually under the impression that the flood account is based off an actual event. What sort of event would inspire the writers of these flood accounts, though, to match pen to paper, or stylus to clay, such a fantastic account? Interestingly, though, more than one flood account may have occurred, sparking a list of potential candidates. One account here is that one account says that a flood filled a vast desert area forming the Mediterranean Sea, happening in the span of a human lifetime. However, this doesn't really play into what we're discussing here, namely because it occurred 5 million years ago, so that's well far removed from the time that it could have any immediate effect on these accounts. But there is one far more convincing candidate for a flood to inspire the writers of the flood accounts, and it comes from Drs. William Ryan and Walter Pitman of Columbia University. And they describe a flood that burst through the Bosporus in 5600 BCE, and that separated Europe from Anatolia. And it was so powerful that it turned a freshwater lake into the Black Sea. Both Ryan and Pitman argue that those who survived this flood remembered it as they migrated to new locations, inspiring flood accounts among the cultures of the ancient Near East, such as the Babylonian and biblical accounts. So, what are my final thoughts here, folks? Well, before Genesis, accounts of a massive flood were already in circulation throughout the ancient Near East. That is, the tale of Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Eridu Genesis are 3 Mesopotamian accounts that tell of this flood following a similar pattern of that one found in Genesis 6 through 9. And each account shares similarities with the other accounts in their recounting of a disastrous flood. Furthermore, there are also hints of the sea myth epic within Genesis 6 through 9 and the flood accounts of Mesopotamia. There is non-order in the form of the chaos waters. There is a construction or reconstruction and resetting of a palace, temple, and creation. And finally, the flood accounts, that is, all of the Mesopotamian accounts, at least theoretically with the Eridu Genesis, and the biblical flood account were inspired by an actual flood that took place in the Bosporus around 5600 BCE. And this flood was then, the account of this flood, was then disseminated or diffused throughout the ancient Near East by immigrants who fled the Bosporus and inspired the writers of these accounts. Well, that concludes this installment on the biblical account of the flood and the ancient Near Eastern flood accounts. So if you guys like this video, don't hesitate to leave that like button and subscribe for more content. And let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And thanks for watching.